The constant critic is not the person who gives you thoughtful feedback out of love. It's the person who makes it their mission to keep you small. And here's the thing, there's a big difference between critique that's meant to help us grow and criticism that's meant to shrink us. Feedback is an investment in relationship. It says, I believe in your capacity to do better. But constant criticism that says, you'll never be enough no matter what you do. And when you are on a path of becoming stronger, braver, more grounded in who you are, the constant critic feels like an anchor tied to your ankle while you're trying to swim. They show up with their nitpicking, their disapproving sighs, their little digs disguised as jokes, and they hope you'll confuse that for truth. Strong women don't confuse it because they know that someone else's inability to celebrate them isn't a reflection of their worth. It's a reflection of that person's own discomfort. When I think about the constant critic, I think about the subtle ways they erode courage. You show up with an idea, they roll their eyes. You take a risk, they immediately point out the one thing that didn't work instead of the 10 things that did. You're excited about a win, they dismiss it as luck, timing, or not that big of a deal. And here's what's really insidious. After a while, you start hearing their voice even when they're not in the room. That inner critic in your head, it often has the same tone, the same phrasing, the same energy as the external critic you've been carrying around. Strong women eventually notice that. They notice how the tape plays in their head and they say, wait, that voice doesn't even belong to me. That's somebody else's fear, somebody else's insecurity. The constant critic teaches you to doubt yourself until you decide you've had enough. Now let's get real about why people become constant critics. It's usually not because they're evil masterminds. It's because vulnerability terrifies them. When you live with courage, when you show up authentically, when you try and fail and try again, it highlights what they're unwilling to do. Your bravery puts a spotlight on their avoidance. So rather than risk failure themselves, they'd rather sit on the sidelines and heckle. It feels safer to point out your cracks than to acknowledge their own. And strong women recognize that pattern for what it is, not a judgment on their ability, but a confession of the critic's fear. The constant critic is someone who has confused perfection with protection, who believes if they can just keep everyone else small, they won't have to confront their own shame. That's not your burden to carry. But here's where it gets tricky. Many constant critics are people close to us, family, friends, even partners. So it's not always as simple as walking away. Sometimes the work is about boundaries, about saying, I love you, but I won't allow you to speak into my life in that way. And let me tell you, strong women understand that boundaries are not walls. They're doors with locks. They open when there's trust and close when there's harm. The constant critic hates boundaries because boundaries mean their voice no longer gets automatic access. They'll call you sensitive, accuse you of overreacting, or insist they're just being honest. But honesty without empathy is brutality, and strong women refuse to confuse the two. So the decision strong women make is not about silencing every voice of dissent. It's about curating the voices that get a seat at the table of their lives. If you're building something meaningful, you need people who can see your humanity and still believe in your capacity. You need people who can say, this is great, and here's where you can grow, without stripping you of your dignity. The constant critic doesn't know how to do that. They only know how to diminish, and that's why strong women don't make space for them in their inner circle. They might still exist on the periphery, they might still be around in certain settings, but they don't get the privilege of shaping how a strong woman sees herself because she's decided that her worth is not up for negotiation. The energy vampire is the person who walks into a room and suddenly you feel like the oxygen level just dropped. You know that feeling, your body tenses, your chest feels heavy, and you start bracing for the emotional load that's about to land on you. These are not the people who come to you in genuine pain or crisis, because we all have moments when we need to lean on each other. No, the energy vampire is different. They are the people who chronically take without giving, who make every interaction about themselves, who drain the room not by accident, but by habit. Strong women learn very quickly that their energy is not infinite, and if they keep pouring into a bottomless cup, they'll eventually run dry. So they choose not to give constant access to those who never fill, never reciprocate, never pause to notice what it costs you to carry them. When you spend time with an energy vampire, you often leave the conversation feeling smaller, weaker, or more exhausted than when you arrived. It's like being hooked up to an emotional IV that only flows one way, and the longer you stay, the more depleted you become. They show up with constant drama, endless complaints, or an ability to turn every situation into a crisis, and they're not looking for solutions. They're looking for an audience. And here's the sneaky part. They often disguise it as intimacy. They'll say things like, "I just need someone to talk to," or "You're the only one who understands me." At first, it feels flattering, like you're special, chosen, the one person who can soothe them. But eventually, you realize it's not about connection, it's about consumption. The energy vampire doesn't actually want to be seen or healed. They just want to feed off the attention and empathy of others, and strong women eventually recognize that pattern and stop confusing being needed with being valued. The reason energy vampires are so dangerous is because they operate in a way that makes you feel guilty for setting limits. They might say, "Wow, I thought you cared about me," or "I guess you're too busy now." And those comments land heavy because we've been trained, especially as women, to equate strength with selflessness. But strength without boundaries is just martyrdom, and strong women don't play that game anymore. They know that compassion without limits turns into resentment, and resentment is poison to the soul. So they learn to listen without absorbing, to be present without becoming drained, and to love without letting themselves be emptied. That's not cruelty. That's stewardship of their own energy, and it's the only way they can keep showing up for the people who matter most. Another layer of this is how energy vampires avoid responsibility. They don't take action to change their circumstances. They just repeat the same draining story on a loop, expecting you to provide the emotional labor every time. You can spend months or even years offering advice, encouragement, or resources, and they'll nod, maybe thank you, but nothing changes. And after a while, you realize they don't want change. They want the comfort of your attention. Strong women know that change can't be outsourced. It has to be chosen. So they stop volunteering to carry someone else's unwillingness. They stop mistaking perpetual crisis for connection, and they stop believing that giving more will finally be enough. They realize that their energy, their presence, their empathy is a gift, not a resource to be mined, and they choose to give it wisely. What makes strong women different in these moments is that they pay attention to the signals their body sends. They notice the exhaustion, the dread, the heaviness that comes after every interaction, and instead of ignoring it, they honor it. They trust that their energy is data, that depletion is a sign, and that protecting their emotional capacity is not selfish but essential, because without energy, without vitality, without a sense of being replenished, there's nothing left to give to the people and projects that actually matter. And so strong women learn to step back, to cut ties when necessary, and to prioritize relationships that bring balance, reciprocity, and joy instead of constant depletion. The chronic victim is the person who has built their entire identity around the belief that life is always happening to them and never with them. They see themselves as powerless, as perpetually wronged, and no matter what resources, support, or opportunities they are offered, it's never enough to move them out of the narrative of suffering. Strong women know that pain is part of life. We all carry stories of hardship, loss, and struggle, but the difference is whether we allow those stories to define us or refine us. The chronic victim refuses to move toward healing because healing requires responsibility, and responsibility feels too heavy. Instead, they stay stuck in blame, pointing fingers outward instead of looking inward. Being around this mindset can feel suffocating because every attempt you make to bring light is swallowed by their commitment to the dark. When you engage with a chronic victim, conversations quickly become one-sided monologues of unfairness, betrayal, and disappointment. They aren't interested in growth, they're interested in validation of their stuckness. You might listen compassionately the first time, maybe even the second, but eventually you realize it's not a passing season, it's a permanent posture. And here's the danger. If you're not careful, you start carrying their helplessness as if it were your own. You begin to believe you owe them endless comfort, endless rescuing, endless patience, and in the process, your energy and hope start to erode. Strong women learn to recognize this drain early because they've done enough inner work to know the difference between someone in temporary pain and someone addicted to the role of the victim. Part of what makes the chronic victim so exhausting is their resistance to accountability. When life goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault. When opportunities fall through, it's because the world is against them. When relationships fail, it's because no one understands them. There's never a willingness to ask, what's my part in this? What can I do differently? And accountability is where growth begins. Without it, there can be no real progress. Strong women understand that accountability is not about blame, it's about agency. It's about reclaiming the power to act, to choose, to change. And when you're in relationship with someone who constantly refuses that agency, you realize you're stuck in a cycle that goes nowhere. That's when strong women step back, not because they lack compassion, but because they know they can't do someone else's healing for them. There's also an emotional manipulation that often comes with the chronic victim. If you try to set a boundary, they interpret it as abandonment. If you encourage them to take responsibility, they accuse you of being unsupportive. They pull you into their emotional whirlpool and expect you to stay submerged with them. And if you resist, they'll say things like, "Everyone always leaves me," or "You don't really care." Strong women hear those words and feel the sting, but they also recognize the tactic. They understand that guilt is a tool used to keep them enmeshed in a role they never agreed to play. And they refuse to keep rehearsing the same script because they know love without truth isn't love, it's enablement. So what strong women do is choose compassion with clarity. They don't harden their hearts or become indifferent, but they do create distance where needed. They might offer empathy, but not entanglement, kindness, but not endless rescuing. They know that every time they try to carry someone who won't walk, they're sacrificing the energy that could be going toward people who are actually ready to rise. And strong women value their energy, their time, their emotional bandwidth too much to let it be endlessly consumed by someone unwilling to meet them halfway. They know that healing is always possible, but only for those who are willing to claim it, and they refuse to confuse pity with love. The manipulator is the person who twists connection into control. They are masters at bending words, shifting narratives, and making you question your own reality. They don't show up in your life waving a red flag. They show up charming, attentive, and often deeply invested in gaining your trust. At first, it feels like they see you, like they value you, like they're in your corner. But slowly, their true pattern emerges. Subtle guilt trips, backhanded compliments, selective truths, and moments where you find yourself apologizing even though you didn't do anything wrong. Strong women eventually see through this fog because manipulation thrives in confusion, and clarity is the antidote. Once you start naming what's happening, once you notice the patterns, you can no longer be controlled in the same way. Being around a manipulator is like being in a constant game of emotional chess. You never know which move is genuine and which one is designed to corner you. They might play the victim to gain sympathy, the hero to gain admiration, or the critic to gain dominance. And the scariest part is that they shift roles so quickly you can lose track of where you stand. One moment you're their savior, the next you're their problem. And in the middle of it all, you're left doubting your own instincts. That's what manipulation does. It separates you from your intuition. Strong women know that intuition is not a luxury, it's survival. So when they feel that knot in their stomach, that twinge in their chest, that whisper that says something is off, they pay attention. They stop brushing it aside because they know their body is often the first to recognize what their mind has been talked out of seeing. What makes the manipulator particularly dangerous is how they use intimacy as leverage. They gather your stories, your secrets, your fears, and they hold them like currency. They might not weaponize it immediately, but the knowledge that they could becomes a silent threat. This creates an atmosphere where you feel like you can't fully confront them because somewhere deep down you fear what they might expose or twist against you. Strong women disrupt this dynamic by refusing to give manipulators access to their deepest truths. They understand that trust must be earned through consistency and integrity, not charisma or charm. And when they realize someone is using closeness to control rather than connect, they no longer offer that level of access. Another layer of manipulation comes in the form of gaslighting, where the manipulator denies your reality, making you feel like you're overreacting or imagining things. You bring up a concern, they say you're too sensitive. You recall something they said, they insist you're remembering it wrong. And after enough rounds of this, you start to wonder if maybe you really are the problem. Strong women recognize this tactic for what it is, an attempt to destabilize their sense of self. They reclaim their reality by grounding themselves in truth, by keeping track of their experiences, and by surrounding themselves with people who mirror back clarity instead of distortion. Because the best defense against manipulation is not playing the game, and strong women refuse to keep playing rounds they can never win. What's most powerful about the way strong women deal with manipulators is that they stop trying to outsmart them and instead focus on outboundarying them. They don't get caught up in endless debates or attempts to prove their worth because they know those battles are rigged from the start. Instead, they draw a firm line, sometimes silently, sometimes explicitly, and they walk away from the cycles of control. Manipulators thrive on access, and once that access is cut off, their power dissolves. Strong women don't need to expose or destroy them. They simply reclaim their time, their energy, and their trust, giving it only to those who have shown themselves capable of honoring it.